The problem of not being able to focus, that quiet, gnawing inability to hold the mind still, actually has a far deeper cause than most people realize. We live in an age that has declared war on the human mind, not through violence, not through propaganda, but through something far more insidious: the endless, frictionless offering of stimulation, a notification here, a headline there, a video that begins before the last one has finished. And in this ocean of input, the mind, your mind, becomes something it was never designed to be. It becomes a mirror shattered into 10,000 pieces, each fragment reflecting a different direction, none of them reflecting you. You sit down to work, and within 40 seconds you are somewhere else. You open a book with genuine intention, and by the third paragraph your attention has slipped away like smoke through an open window. You try to think clearly about something that matters, a decision, a relationship, a direction for your life, and the thoughts come in disorganized waves, crashing and retreating, leaving nothing solid behind. And so you do what everyone does. You try harder. You download another focus app. You buy a new planner. You make another resolution. You tell yourself, tomorrow I will concentrate. Tomorrow I will be disciplined. Tomorrow the mind will obey.
But tomorrow comes, and the same fracture is still there, because the problem you have been treating is not the real problem. You have been treating the symptom. The Tipitaka, the oldest, most complete record of the Buddha's teachings, preserved across 25 centuries in the ancient language of Pāli, tells us something that modern neuroscience is only beginning to confirm: that distraction is not a failure of willpower. It is not a character flaw. It is not a disease to be medicated or a bug to be patched. Distraction is the natural condition of an untrained mind. And an untrained mind is not one that lacks discipline. It is one that has never been shown the truth about itself.
Today, we will excavate the roots of that truth. We will not offer you a list of productivity tips. We will not hand you a calendar hack dressed in monk's robes. What we will offer is something older and more radical: a complete architecture of the focused mind, drawn directly from the Tipitaka, the Satipatthana Sutta, the Anapanasati Sutta, the Samādhi Sutta, and the passages on jhana recorded in the Digha Nikaya and Majjhima Nikaya, and interpreted through the lens of contemporary neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and the philosophical traditions of East and West. Once you understand what the Buddha actually taught about focus, not the watered-down, commodified version sold in wellness apps, but the real teaching, the full teaching, the teaching that was considered so transformative it was memorized by generations of monks who had no paper and no ink, it will completely transform not just how you work, but how you exist inside your own life. The monks who trained under this system did not merely become productive, they became free. Let us find out why.
What was the world the Buddha spoke into, and why it still speaks to ours? 25 centuries ago, in the river valleys and forest groves of what is now northern India and Nepal, a man who had renounced a kingdom sat beneath a tree and asked a question that no empire, no wealth, and no ritual had been able to answer. Why does the mind suffer, and what can be done about it? The answer he arrived at, through direct observation, through years of meditative investigation, through a methodology so rigorous it anticipates the scientific method by 2 millennia, was not mystical, it was empirical. It was a map of how the mind actually works. That map became the Tipitaka, 3 baskets of teaching: the Vinaya Pitaka, the rules of conduct; the Sutta Pitaka, the discourses; and the Abhidhamma Pitaka, the systematic philosophical analysis. Together, they constitute the most comprehensive investigation of the human mind ever assembled in the ancient world. And running through all three baskets, like a spine through a living body, is a single consistent teaching about attention, about where the mind goes, about what pulls it away, about how to bring it home.
The Buddha taught in a world that was, in its own way, just as distracting as ours. Ancient India was a civilization of competing philosophies, conflicting rituals, merchant anxieties, political upheavals, and the constant hum of desire that has never left the human animal. The wandering ascetics of that era debated endlessly. The merchant class worried endlessly. The priests performed endlessly. And everywhere, the mind was being pulled in directions it did not consciously choose. What the Buddha offered was not an escape from that world. It was something more radical, a way of existing inside it with complete clarity. He called the capacity for that clarity Samādhi, and he placed it at the very heart of the path toward liberation. Samādhi is a Pāli word that comes from the root sam, meaning together or complete, and adi, meaning to place or to put. Samādhi is the placing together of the mind, the gathering in, the unification of attention that allows a human being to see things, themselves, their experience, the world, with a precision that a scattered mind can never achieve. But here is the central conflict that this episode exists to resolve. And it is a conflict that almost everyone who has ever tried to meditate, tried to concentrate, tried to be more mindful has encountered. The modern understanding of focus treats it as a force, something to be applied, something to be exerted against the resistance of distraction. We speak of forcing ourselves to concentrate, of pulling the mind back, of not letting it wander. We treat focus as a muscle that must be strained to grow. The Tipitaka teaches the precise opposite. Samādhi is not force, it is not suppression, it is not the victory of discipline over desire. It is a natural emergence, the way water becomes still, not because you press it flat, but because you remove what was disturbing it. That distinction is not semantic. It changes everything about how you train, what you observe, and what you are capable of becoming. And understanding it, truly understanding it, in your bones and not just your vocabulary, is what separates the person who meditates for years without transformation from the person who understands in a single sitting why the mind is the way it is.
Wait, have you ever experienced this? You are trying to focus on something important, something that genuinely matters to you, and you cannot. But it is not because you are lazy. It's not because the task is too hard. It is because somewhere beneath the surface of your attention, something is pulling. Some unresolved conversation, some small dishonesty you carried out last week that left a residue you cannot name. Some resentment you told yourself you had released, but that still hums at the frequency of your distraction. The Tipitaka saw this with surgical clarity, and it named it. In the Samanyapala Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, the Buddha describes the path to Samādhi not as a single leap of will, but as a layered architecture. 3 interlocking foundations that must be built in sequence, each one making the next possible. They are Sīla, ethical conduct, Sati, mindful awareness, and Samādhi, unified concentration. These are not 3 separate practices. They are 3 layers of a single movement toward interior stillness.
Layer 1. Sīla, the clearing of cognitive noise. Sīla, in the Tipitaka, is not morality in the legalistic sense, a list of rules obeyed out of fear of punishment. It is a description of the relationship between action and mental state. When a person acts in ways that are harmful, through deceit, through cruelty, through the small violences of taking what was not given, the mind registers the dissonance. The Pāli word for this residue is kukucha. It means remorse or regret, or the specific mental friction that arises when one's actions do not align with one's understanding. Kukucha is not guilt in the neurotic, self-punishing sense. It is a signal. It is the mind's way of marking an unresolved account. And as long as those accounts remain open, the mind cannot fully gather itself. It is like trying to read in a room where 100 conversations are happening simultaneously. You can force your attention to the page, but part of your processing power, and neuroscience confirms that this is precisely what is happening, that working memory and executive attention are genuinely depleted by unresolved emotional conflict, is perpetually allocated to the background noise. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most responsible for sustained attention and goal-directed behavior, is also the region most compromised by what psychologists call affective interference, the intrusion of emotionally charged material into cognitive processing. A 2007 study published in the journal Cognition demonstrated that participants who were carrying unresolved social conflict performed significantly worse on sustained attention tasks than a control group, not because they were less intelligent or less motivated, but because their attentional resources were divided.
The Buddha taught this 25 centuries before the study was conducted. Sīla clears the noise. When you are not carrying the weight of unreconciled actions, when your relationship with others and with yourself is clean, not perfect, but clean, the mind has less to process beneath the surface. The background hum quiets, and in that quiet, the first conditions for genuine concentration begin to emerge. This is why monastic communities across virtually every contemplative tradition have placed ethical conduct at the foundation of meditative training, not because monks are morally superior to lay people, but because they understood, empirically and through centuries of observation, that a mind entangled in ethical confusion cannot gather itself. The effort required to concentrate is simply too great when the field itself is disturbed. For those of us who do not live in monasteries, who have jobs, families, obligations, and the specific moral complexities of a life lived fully in the world, this teaching does not demand perfection. It asks for honesty. It asks for the willingness to look at where your actions create dissonance and to address that dissonance rather than suppress it. That willingness itself is a form of Sīla, and it is a more powerful concentration aid than any app or technique currently being sold.
Layer 2. Sati, the art of returning. This next part is critically important because it is the layer that almost everyone misunderstands, even people who have been meditating for years. Sati is usually translated as mindfulness, and in the past 2 decades, mindfulness has become a cultural phenomenon, a therapeutic tool, a corporate wellness program, a word that appears on coffee cups and in executive retreats and in clinical trials for anxiety disorders. Much of this is genuinely good. The therapeutic applications of mindfulness-based practices are well documented and real. But the commodification of mindfulness has quietly stripped away something essential. It has made sati sound passive, gentle, a matter of noticing, accepting, flowing. The Satipatthana Sutta, one of the most important texts in the entire Pāli Canon, describes something far more active and precise. Sati is not merely noticing, it is a continuous, deliberate act of returning. The sutta describes 4 foundations of mindful awareness: the body, kaya, one's physical experience, the breath, the posture, the sensations of the present moment; feelings, vedana,
Not emotions in the complex narrative sense, but the fundamental quality of each moment of experience as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Mind, citta, the quality of awareness itself, whether it is clear or cloudy, contracted or spacious, agitated or calm. And mental phenomena, Dhamma, the specific mental events that arise, desire, aversion, confusion, insight.
The practice the sutta prescribes is not to eliminate any of these. It is to observe them with continuity, and the crucial word is continuity, not one observation, brilliant and then forgotten, but an ongoing, returning, re-establishing of awareness that trains the mind over time to remain present, not because it is forced to, but because it has learned through practice that the present moment is more interesting than anything the wandering mind can produce. This is a profound reversal of how most people think about distraction. We tend to think of the present moment as boring, the thing we are trying to escape when we check our phones or let our minds drift to tomorrow's anxieties or yesterday's regrets. The Tipitaka suggests that the present moment only feels boring to a mind that has been trained by overstimulation to require constant novelty. A mind that has been trained in Sati finds the present moment inexhaustible, not because it performs spiritual gymnastics of appreciation, but because with sufficient clarity of attention, every moment of direct experience contains more information, more texture, more aliveness than the mind's projections ever could.
Modern neuroscience has arrived at a remarkably similar conclusion through a different route. The default mode network, the region of the brain that activates during mind wandering, self-referential thought, and rumination, is metabolically expensive. A resting brain in default mode is not resting. It is consuming significant energy on mental activity that, studies consistently show, correlates with decreased well-being, increased anxiety, and reduced cognitive performance. Mindfulness training, confirmed by neuroimaging studies at Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford, consistently reduces default mode network activity and strengthens the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the regions responsible for present-moment sensory processing. The monks, in other words, were doing neuroscience. They were redesigning their own brain architecture through the systematic practice of returning attention to the present. And that word, returning, is everything. The practice of sati is not about achieving a state of perfect, unbroken concentration. It is about noticing when the mind has wandered and returning without judgment. Noticing and returning, again and again. Not 10 times and then declaring success or failure, 10,000 times, 100,000 times, until the gap between wandering and returning becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and the mind begins, almost of its own accord, to prefer the present. Layer 3. Samādhi, the unification of the mind. So far, we have covered 2 of the 3 layers: Sīla, which removes the noise, Sati, which stabilizes the attention, and now we arrive at Samādhi itself, the apex of the architecture, the destination that the first 2 layers have been building toward. In the Samanyapala Sutta and throughout the Digha Nikaya, the Buddha describes Samādhi through the framework of jhana, meditative absorption. There are 4 jhanas described in the canon, each one a progressively deeper unification of the mind. But before discussing what they are, it is worth understanding what they feel like, because this is where the Tipitaka becomes genuinely extraordinary. The Buddha describes the first jhana as a state of complete seclusion from sensual pleasures and unwholesome states, characterized by the arising of applied thought and sustained thought, viṭaka and vichara, and suffused by piti and sukha, a joy and happiness that the canon describes as arising from seclusion,
not from stimulation, not the pleasure of getting what you wanted, the pleasure of no longer needing it.
He uses an analogy in the Samanyaphala Sutta of a skilled bath attendant kneading soap powder with water until it becomes a perfectly cohesive ball, permeated throughout with moisture, no part dry, no part separate. This is what the first jhana feels like, the mind permeated throughout with clarity and joy, no part of it pulling away in another direction. The second jhana deepens this. The applied and sustained thought quiets. The mind is no longer effortfully directing attention, but has settled into an internal confidence, an ekaggata, a one-pointedness that no longer requires force. Joy and happiness remain, but they arise now from a silence deeper than the first. The third and fourth jhanas progressively refine this until the mind rests in a stillness that the Canon describes as luminous, unshakable, and enormously powerful. Not powerful in the sense of domination, but in the sense of a diamond, the same material as ordinary carbon, but organized under immense pressure and time into something that can cut anything without being cut. This is what the Buddha means by the phrase that appears throughout the Nikayas, samahite chitte yata bhutam pajanati. The concentrated mind knows things as they really are. The focused mind is not more focused for productivity's sake. It is more focused because a scattered mind can only see fragments of reality, and a unified mind can see the whole.
The 5 enemies, what the Tipitaka names as the destroyers of attention. This is something you genuinely need to know, because the Tipitaka does not only tell you how to build the focused mind, it gives you, with remarkable precision, a taxonomy of everything that destroys it. The 5 niwarana, the 5 hindrances, are described throughout the Pāli Canon, most comprehensively in the Niwarana Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya. They are not metaphors, they are psychological categories, each one describing a specific mechanism by which the mind loses its capacity for samadhi. The first hindrance is kama-chanda, sensual desire. Not merely the desire for physical pleasure, but the broader movement of the mind towards stimulation, novelty, and the next thing. In the 21st century, kama-chanda has been weaponized with engineering precision. Every social media platform, every streaming service, every notification system has been explicitly designed by some of the most talented engineers and behavioral scientists in the world to exploit this exact mechanism. The brain's dopaminergic reward system, which evolved to motivate the pursuit of food, sex, and social connection, is being continuously activated and reset by platforms that understand kama-chanda better than most meditators do. The result is a mind trained to its core in the direction of perpetual seeking. A mind that, when placed in a task requiring sustained, non-stimulating attention, experiences something close to withdrawal.
The second hindrance is vyapada, ill will, anger, irritation, resentment. When the mind is carrying hostility toward a colleague, toward a political figure, toward oneself, it cannot unify. Anger has been shown in studies of attentional control to activate the amygdala in ways that reliably override prefrontal executive function. The Buddha's observation that a mind heated by ill will cannot enter samadhi is, neurologically, a description of amygdala hijack. The ancient language and the modern science are mapping the same territory. The third hindrance is thina midha, sloth and torpor, mental fog, the dullness that settles over the mind when it is underslept, overfed, emotionally depleted, or simply habituated to low-quality stimulus.
The canon distinguishes between this and ordinary tiredness. Thina midha is not just the need for rest, it is the contraction of the mind's vital energy, a kind of motivated non-engagement that can feel like peace, but is in fact absence. This is also the state that many people mistake for meditation, sitting with eyes closed in a kind of pleasant fog, neither truly present nor truly concentrated. The fourth hindrance is uddhacca kukucca, restlessness and worry. This is the agitated mind, the mind that cannot stay in one place, that rehearses tomorrow's meeting and relitigates last month's mistake, and generates catastrophic scenarios for events that have not occurred and may never occur. Modern psychology calls this rumination. The Buddha called it one of the 5 enemies of the concentrated mind. Both are correct. And restlessness is perhaps the most dominant hindrance in contemporary life, the perpetual background hum of anxiety that a culture saturated in uncertainty and acceleration has made into its default operating mode.
The fifth hindrance is vicikicca, doubt. Not the healthy, investigative doubt that leads to inquiry, but the paralyzing doubt that prevents action. The doubt that says, what if this path is wrong? What if my effort is misplaced? What if nothing works? In the context of meditative training, vicikicca is the voice that interrupts every session with the suggestion that you might be doing it incorrectly, that someone else's method is superior, that perhaps the whole enterprise is a waste of time. In the context of work and study, it manifests as decision paralysis, the inability to commit, which the behavioral economist Dan Ariely has documented as one of the primary causes of chronic underperformance in otherwise capable people. Hold on, there is one more thing that matters here. The Tipitaka does not describe these 5 hindrances as moral failings. It describes them as natural tendencies of an untrained mind. Tendencies that, when recognized and understood, can be worked with skillfully. The recognition itself is the beginning of the work, because you cannot address what you cannot name. And now you have their names.
The Monk's Protocol, a step-by-step practice based on the Tipitaka. So far, we have covered the 3-layer architecture of the focused mind and the 5 enemies that stand against it. Now we enter the heart of the protocol, a practical, sequential framework drawn directly from the suttas, particularly the Anapanasati Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, one of the most detailed and practical meditation texts in the entire Pāli Canon. Step 1. Set intention through chanda. The Tipitaka makes a subtle but profound distinction between craving, tanha, and wholesome desire, chanda. Craving is the wanting that tightens around its object, that says, I need this to be well. Chanda is the aspiration that opens outward, that says, I orient myself in this direction because it is meaningful and true. Before any session of focused work or meditation, the monk's protocol begins with an explicit act of chanda. Not a performance of motivation, not a pep talk, a simple, honest inquiry. Why does this matter? What is the quality of my intention in this moment? The difference is not philosophical, it is functional. A mind anchored in chanda is working with itself. A mind driven by tanha, by the anxiety of outcomes, by the craving to appear competent, by the fear of failure, is working against itself. And the research on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, conducted over decades by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan in their self-determination theory, consistently confirms what the Tipitaka described. Intrinsic motivation, motivation anchored in the genuine meaning of what you are doing, produces sustained attention and higher quality cognitive performance than extrinsic motivation anchored in reward or punishment. Set your chanda before you begin, not dramatically, honestly.
Step 2. Practice Indriya Samvara, the guarding of the senses. The Buddha taught Indriya Samvara, the guarding of the sense gates, as a foundational preparation for meditation. In its monastic form, this means regulating what the eye sees, what the ear hears, what the tongue tastes, what the mind engages with. In its contemporary form, it means something both simpler and more demanding. It means managing your information environment. The Chula Dukkaka Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya describes in vivid detail how sensory input that is not regulated becomes the seed of craving, which becomes the seed of distraction, which becomes the enemy of Samādhi. This is not asceticism for its own sake. It is engineering. The monk who guards his senses is doing what the contemporary digital minimalist attempts to do when they delete social media from their phone, reducing the supply of kama chanda before the work of attention training begins. Before a focused session, this means close unnecessary browser tabs, silence notifications, if possible, remove the phone from the room entirely. The Tipitaka does not moralize about devices, but it is absolutely clear that a mind continuously offered the next stimulus cannot gather itself. Restraint is not repression, it is preparation.
Step 3. Anchor to Anapanasati, the breath as home. The Anapanasati Sutta describes 16 steps of breath awareness, from the most basic, knowing that one is inhaling when inhaling, knowing that one is exhaling when exhaling, to the most refined, where the meditator observes the breath as a window into impermanence, the arising and passing of phenomena, and the nature of consciousness itself. For practical purposes, the anchor is the breath in its simplest form, not controlled breathing, not pranayama or box breathing or any of the breath techniques of other traditions. Simply, when you inhale, know that you are inhaling. When you exhale, know that you are exhaling.
The breath is the perfect object of attention for several reasons that the Tipitaka implicitly encodes and neuroscience has explicitly confirmed. It is always present. You cannot leave your breath behind the way you can leave a book or a screen. It is neither exciting nor boring. It does not trigger kama chanda the way a stimulating object would, nor does it induce thina middha the way a monotonous abstraction might. It is anchored in the body, which means attention to it naturally reduces activity in the default mode network and increases activity in the networks associated with present moment processing. And it is impermanent. Every breath is different. The meditator who pays true attention to the breath, not a conceptual breath, not an idea of breathing, but the actual moment-to-moment physical reality of inhalation and exhalation, is practicing impermanence directly, not as a doctrine, but as a fact of experience. And the Buddha taught that it is the direct experience of impermanence, anicca, that begins to loosen the mind's grip on its habitual distractions, because distraction at its root is a flight from the experience of impermanence. It is the mind preferring its own fabrications to the plain, always changing truth of what is.
Step 4. Handle distraction without violence. When the mind wanders, and it will wander constantly, especially in the early stages of training, the instruction of the Tipitaka is remarkable in its simplicity and its departure from the willpower model. Do not fight the wandering mind. Do not punish it. Do not generate frustration at the fact of distraction, because frustration is itself a form of vyapada, and vyapada is a hindrance. Simply note that the mind has wandered and return. This is not passivity. It is a highly precise form of action, the action of non-reaction. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, wrote something that resonates with this instruction with uncanny precision, that we suffer not from events, but from the judgments we place upon them. The wandering mind is not a problem. The judgment that the wandering mind is a problem, that is the additional suffering layered on top of the simple fact. The monk's instruction is to treat each moment of recognized wandering as a success, not a failure. You noticed, you returned. That is the practice. That is the entire practice. Every time the mind wanders and you bring it back, you are not failing to meditate, you are meditating. You are exercising precisely the muscle that Sati is designed to develop. Contemporary research on what psychologist Judson Brewer calls the curious mind confirms this mechanism. When meditators are instructed to approach their distractions with curiosity rather than aversion, to note them without judgment and return, the frequency of distraction decreases more rapidly than when the instruction is to suppress or avoid. Curiosity, it turns out, is a more effective tool than force. The Tipitaka knew this. It simply called it non-reactivity.
Step 5. Enter Upachara Samādhi and allow the flow state to emerge. As the practice deepens across a single session or across weeks and months of training, something begins to happen that cannot quite be forced and cannot quite be planned. The interval between distraction and return grows longer. The pull of kamachanda weakens. The mind, having returned to the breath 10,000 times, begins to find the returning easier. The effort required to stay present diminishes, and in its place, something arises that the Tipitaka calls piti, a kind of joy that is not excitement, not the pleasure of having gotten something you wanted, but the quiet, unmistakable pleasure of being completely here. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi documented this state in the 1990s under the name flow, a state of optimal performance and deep engagement characterized by effortless concentration, a distorted sense of time, intrinsic reward, and a temporary dissolution of the boundary between self and task. He observed it in athletes, musicians, surgeons, mathematicians, and artisans. He described it as the peak of human functioning. The Tipitaka describes Upachara Samādhi, access concentration, as the threshold state that precedes the full absorption of jhana. It has precisely the characteristics Csikszentmihalyi documented. The effort of attention has given way to a smooth, continuous, self-sustaining engagement. The 5 hindrances have not been destroyed, they have simply become quiet for now. This state is not reserved for monasteries. The monk's protocol is simply a more systematic way of approaching what anyone who has ever been genuinely absorbed in their work, truly absorbed, not performing absorption, has briefly touched. The difference is that the trained mind can enter it intentionally, sustain it reliably, and understand what it is when it arrives.
Comparison, context, and the depth beneath the practice. The Buddha was not alone in recognizing that the quality of attention determines the quality of life. Across the world and across centuries, the same observation has been made, in different languages and through different frameworks. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Rome and Greece, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, placed the governance of attention at the center of their ethical system. Epictetus taught that the only thing truly in our power is the direction of our mind. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that the quality of one's life is determined by the quality of one's thoughts, and that thoughts, like a garden, require cultivation. This resonates profoundly with the Buddhist framework. Both traditions identify the untrained, reactive mind as the source of suffering. Both prescribe a disciplined practice of returning to what is actually present, actual, and chosen. But the difference is significant and worth examining. Stoicism is primarily a philosophy of endurance, of bearing what cannot be changed with grace and without complaint.
It cultivates a focused mind in service of right action and right character. Buddhism cultivates a focused mind in service of liberation, not just from external adversity, but from the very mechanism of suffering itself, the craving and aversion that operate beneath the level of conscious choice. The Zen tradition, which evolved from the Chan Buddhism brought from India to China and then to Japan, shares with Theravada Buddhism the central emphasis on direct awareness. Zen practice, whether in the form of sitting meditation, zazen, or the paradoxical questions of the koan, is fundamentally a training of the mind to remain present with what is, rather than with what it imagines or fears. Where Theravada Buddhism offers an explicit, systematic map of the territory, the niwarana, the jhanas, the satipatthana, Zen tends toward immediacy and radical simplicity. Both are pointing at the same moon. The fingers are different. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, composed somewhere between the 2nd century BCE and the 4th century CE, also place Samādhi at the pinnacle of practice, the 8th and final limb of Ashtanga Yoga, preceded by ethical constraints, physical postures, breath control, and progressively deepening stages of meditation. The parallels with the Buddhist tripartite structure of Sīla, Sati, Samādhi are striking. Both systems understood that the body, the breath, and conduct in the world must be addressed before the mind can truly gather itself. But the metaphysical frameworks differ. Yoga posits an eternal individual self, Atman, that Samādhi ultimately purifies and reveals. Buddhism posits anatta, not self, the radical observation that there is no fixed, permanent self to be purified. What is revealed in Buddhist Samādhi is not the self in its purest form. It is the absence of the self as a fixed and necessary center. And that revelation is, for the Buddha, the deepest liberation of all.
For the working adult or senior who has never meditated, who carries the weight of decades of habitual distraction and the specific exhaustion of a world that has demanded more and more of less and less focused attention, these philosophical distinctions may feel distant, but they matter for the following reason. They determine what you are training toward. If you practice focus as a productivity tool, you will become somewhat more productive. If you practice it as a philosophical discipline, understanding that the quality of your attention is the quality of your life, that what you attend to is, in the most literal sense, what you are, you will become something more, not more efficient, more awake.
What focus does to you, and what it does to the world around you. The benefits of Samādhi training, both the pragmatic and the profound, are documented across dimensions that the Tipitaka described and that contemporary research has independently confirmed. Cognitively, the trained attention reduces activity in the default mode network and strengthens the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, the region responsible for detecting conflicts between current focus and competing impulses. This means not just better concentration, but better error detection, better self-regulation, and better decision-making. A 2015 meta-analysis published in Psychological Bulletin examined 209 studies on mindfulness training and found consistent, robust improvements across measures of working memory, cognitive flexibility, and stress reactivity. Emotionally, the practice of observing Vedana, the felt quality of experience, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, gradually reduces what the Buddha called papancha, the proliferation of mental constructs. The ordinary mind takes a neutral event and within seconds elaborates it into a narrative of threat or opportunity, inadequacy or pride. This elaboration is not reality. It is the mind's compulsive fiction writing. As Samadhi deepens, the gap between raw experience and narrative elaboration widens. You feel what arises, the irritation, the anxiety, the desire, without being controlled by it. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who developed logotherapy, described this gap as the space between stimulus and response. For Frankl, that space was where freedom lived. The Tipitaka had been training people to inhabit that space for 25 centuries before Frankl named it. A mind trained in Sati and Samādhi is less reactive, less likely to respond to a colleague's criticism with defensive anger, less likely to make a decision under the influence of vyapada or uddhacca, less likely to project its own unexamined fear onto the people around it. The social consequences of this are not small. Research on organizations has consistently found that leadership quality correlates not primarily with intelligence or charisma, but with what psychologists call emotional granularity, the capacity to identify and work with one's own emotional states with precision. This is Vedana practice applied to organizational life.
And at the level that the Tipitaka describes as the ultimate purpose, the level of paññā, of wisdom, the focused mind begins to see something that the distracted mind simply cannot perceive. It begins to see the constructed nature of its own suffering. It begins to recognize the movements of craving and aversion not as facts about the world, but as habits of the mind, patterns that were learned and can therefore be unlearned. And in that recognition, the first cracks appear in what the Buddha called avidya, ignorance, not the ignorance of lacking information, but the fundamental non-seeing of the way the mind makes its own suffering. The focused mind, in the end, is not just more productive, it is more compassionate. Not because compassion has been added to it, but because craving and aversion have been reduced, and what remains beneath them, the natural warmth of karuna, of metta, of the mind's capacity to meet another being without the distorting lens of its own fear, is given room to breathe.
Bringing it all together. Let us bring everything together. First, focus, as the Tipitaka teaches it, is not a technique. It is a natural emergence. Like a flame that burns steadily when the wind has been removed, the mind focuses effortlessly when the conditions that disturb it have been understood and addressed. Those conditions, the 5 hindrances, are not character flaws. They are the default tendencies of an untrained mind in a world that has never taught it otherwise. Second, the architecture of the focused mind is built in 3 interlocking layers. Sīla, the ethical foundation that removes cognitive noise. Sati, the mindful awareness that stabilizes and returns attention. And Samādhi, the unified concentration that emerges when the first 2 are in place. You cannot shortcut this architecture, but you can begin building it today with the materials you already have. Third, the monk's protocol is not esoteric. Setting wholesome intention, guarding the senses, anchoring to the breath, returning without judgment, allowing the flow state to emerge. These are not spiritual superpowers, they are trainable skills. Skills that monks have practiced systematically, and that modern neuroscience has confirmed produce measurable, lasting changes in brain architecture and cognitive performance.
And most importantly, the deepest teaching is this. The problem is not distraction. The problem is the attachment to distraction, the habitual turning away from the present moment because the mind has been trained to believe that the next thing will be more interesting, more satisfying, more complete. What Samādhi teaches is that the present moment, attended to fully, is not less than the next thing. It is the only thing. It is the place where your life is actually happening, right now, while part of your mind is somewhere else. When you understand this, not as a concept, but as a felt truth, the quality of your attention changes, not because you have forced it to, but because you have seen, clearly, what its wandering has been costing you.
What I would like you to do after this episode. Here is what I would like you to do after listening to this episode. Step 1. Tomorrow morning, before you open your phone, before you check anything, sit quietly for 5 minutes. Not to achieve a state, not to be peaceful, simply to breathe with awareness, knowing that you are inhaling when you inhale, knowing that you are exhaling when you exhale. And when the mind wanders, simply return. That is all. Just that. Step 2. Identify one area of your daily life where kukucha, unresolved action, is generating background noise. You know what it is. You have known for some time. It may be a conversation you have been avoiding, a commitment you made and have not honored, a small dishonesty you have been carrying. Take one concrete step to address it, not to be morally perfect, but because your mind deserves the quiet that integrity produces. Step 3. For 1 week, practice what the Tipitaka calls single tasking, the ekagatta principle applied to daily life. One task at a time. When you eat, eat. When you work, work. When you speak with someone, be with them. Not as a performance of presence, but as an honest experiment in what it feels like to give one thing your complete attention. Begin with whichever step feels most honest, most alive, most necessary. The order does not matter. What matters most is that you begin. Community and continuation. Tell us in the comments which of these 3 steps you will try first and why. Your answer might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Share an experience you have had with the wandering mind, a moment when you lost your focus and understood, later, what had really been happening beneath the surface. These stories are not confessions of failure. They are maps that others can use. If you found this episode valuable, subscribe to Buddha Wisdom Teachings, not because you need more content, but because the path of understanding deepens with sustained engagement, and we have many more territories to explore together. And tell us in the comments, what would you like us to examine next? The neuroscience of compassion? The Buddhist philosophy of time and memory? The relationship between Samādhi and creativity? The Tipitaka's teaching on grief? We are listening.
There is a passage in the Majjhima Nikaya where the Buddha compares the untrained mind to a fish pulled from the water and thrown onto dry land, thrashing, frantic, moving in every direction and no direction, spending its entire energy on the act of its own disturbance. And the trained mind? He does not describe it as still. He describes it as a flame burning in a sheltered place where no wind reaches. Not motionless, alive, but steady. The light it gives is not diminished by its steadiness. It is made possible by it. You have lived, most likely, as that fish, thrashing, moving fast, going far, and returning often with less than you left with. The teaching in the Tipitaka is not asking you to stop moving. It is not asking you to renounce the world or sit in a cave or detach from everything you love. It is asking you to do something far more radical and far more available. Pay attention to what you are paying attention to. Because the mind that watches itself, the mind that notices where it goes, why it goes there, what it was seeking and what it found instead, that mind is already beginning the work. Not the performance of focus, not the discipline of concentration as an act of willpower, but the genuine, curious, honest investigation of the one instrument you have been using your entire life without ever reading the manual.
The manual exists. It was written 25 centuries ago by a man who sat in a forest and refused to stop looking until he saw what was true. It has been preserved, tested, refined, and validated by generations of monks who found that it worked, by neuroscientists who found that it changes the brain, by philosophers who found that it answers questions their own traditions had left open. It is available to you now, not tomorrow, not after you have fixed everything else. Now, in the breath you are drawing as these words reach you. Inhale. Know that you are inhaling. The rest will follow.